Hi, it's Neil here, and we're looking at the session where we're getting into the supplier model. We really want to understand the pressures that China suppliers are under, and these are the pressures that cause them to copy, to outsource, to substitute materials, even without telling you. And so there are strategies for dealing with this, and those strategies are going to be much more effective if you understand why they do these behaviours. So let's have a look at the good stuff, shall we? Again, we just our catchphrase. If you can better understand the supplier's challenges, you're in a better position to work with them. So let's get on to our framework, and this is the China Supplier Competitive Model. It was briefly introduced in the last session, but now we're going to get into it, and we're getting into it in a real way because this is derived from field studies from over interviews with over 20 companies, multinationals and Chinese companies operating in China, and they were both serving domestic and international, so it was a broad range and across a whole range of industries. And this is what we've come up with, this framework. This is what we learned from over these 20 of these interviews, individually, each 30 minutes each. We had over 30,000 words of documentation of transcripts. We had lots of things to put together, and these are the themes that we came up with. And that is that Chinese suppliers are facing pressure from two dominant sources. One is from foreigners who are already in China selling downstream, selling to the consumer. And we can understand the everyday foreigners that are in China, for example, McDonald's, the Starbucks, and now we've got the motor vehicle manufacturers selling in China. Volkswagen has been there for over 40 years. This is a big pressure that's on China suppliers in the hope that they want to sell domestically also. Another big pressure for Chinese suppliers is actually international customers, and that is international export. And these international customers put a lot of pressure on the suppliers, and especially in the electronics industry. You've got cost down 5% every 3 months. That's a norm in that industry, and so not every supplier is equipped to deal with that, and many of them do not survive. You want to separate out the ones that will survive from the ones that won't, because you want to partner with the ones that are going to be around next year and the year after that. So there is some method in our madness here to get behind, peel back down and try to understand what are the pressures on China suppliers. When you know those pressures, then you have a better understanding of how they're going to respond to them. You might be in a better position to actually help them, suggest ways in which China suppliers can not only work better with you, but how they work better with other customers. And that could be a win-win situation there. And they get to have a better relationship with you. Why? Because they see that you're helping them. You're interested in their total business, not just the business that they're doing with you. So let's keep that in mind. This is the viewpoint that we have, and this framework really helps to understand what's going on here. So let's get into the interview, shall we? And this is where we actually interviewed over 20 companies, over half an hour each, 2010 into 2011. We'll just show you a snippet of some of those interviews here. But what is important, you had a broad range of industries, importers, exporters, all different types. And we spoke to all different types of managers, technology development managers, sales managers, research and development managers, CFOs, all types of managers. So we got a broad range of perspectives on what is the challenge for Chinese suppliers, how they're responding to that challenge. And here is the first table we want to show, because what we did is citation analysis. And basically what citation analysis is all about, looking for patterns. So we do the interviews, then we transcribe all the interviews, and we got over 30,000 words into a document from answers to one question, and then we look through those sentences across those various companies that we interviewed, and we're looking for patterns. And so the first pattern we might come up with is this pressure to sell products at a lower cost, or to offer more features for the same price point. And then we count through the 20 interviews to see, did that pattern occur again? And what we did counted was, it did happen 11 times, the pattern for this first pressure. Now the second pressure from foreign domestic competition is the foreign competitor viewed as a role model to copy management and marketing practices. That was cited 9 times. The third one, more transparency in the industry, which reduces the value of Guanxi in transactions with customers. That was noted over 7 times. So what we mean by transparency reduces the value of Guanxi, it meaning that the more involvement of foreigners in engagement with customers, for example in department stores where they're giving more information, they have more professional salespeople explaining to customers. In some ways, those foreign brands in department stores are going to attract customers more so than the domestic brands. And so domestic companies tend to get space in department stores based on how good a relationship they have with the department store, not just based on sales. And so as department stores see that while these foreign brands are having more sales, that's more revenue and lease space for the department store, they're prepared to give more space for the foreign brands. And so increasingly, Guanxi is not having as a powerful advantage for domestic products in these department stores. So that's what we we mean by this third reason, and that was quoted by 7 of our interviews. The next one, number 4, was pressure to offer better paying conditions to retain skilled employees, and we can understand that. A lot of young people now, they are leaving domestic factories, they are leaving domestic companies to work for foreign companies for many reasons. Number 1, being associated with a foreign company, that has good kudos, that has symbolism, and they're happy to tell their parents, they're happy to tell their relatives, I work for HTC, I work for IBM, I work for Apple, okay, compared to a Chinese company. Number 2, these foreign companies are bringing in foreign practices in terms of training, career development, coaching, personal development. These are non-monetary incentives that weren't normally provided by domestic companies and domestic factories. And so domestic factories, if they want to compete to keep the same staff, they not only have to pay extra, like an efficiency wage of 10% more, they also have to do all these non-monetary things. And so there's pressure on domestic companies, suppliers, to channel funds into these non-monetary activities to retain employees. Number 5, pressure to spend more on product development, marketing, in order to compete in the same market segment. That was quoted by 2, but just understand, it's the same way. It's an indirect pressure because foreign companies are bringing in more sophisticated marketing approaches, and domestic companies have to respond to these approaches. Otherwise, they're going to die. They're not going to be able to attract consumers to their products if they don't have a similar marketing approach in terms of the design and layout for advertising, who they get to represent their products, and so forth. So you can see there's a lot of influences coming from, not from the multinationals that are importing from China, exporting out of China, but from multinationals that are operating in China, trying to get a slice of the consumer pie. Let's go to the next set of themes, shall we? And that is the nature of influence of the international customer. That is, like the Apple, the HTC, when they go to suppliers through Foxconn, the second tier and third tier suppliers, they're putting pressure on Foxconn and their suppliers to make things cheaper, to do other things. Let's have a look at the list of items. And these are targeted on factories that want to export. And as we talked about in another session, in the previous session, there were 4 different reasons for why suppliers may want to be attached to these international buyers. Do you remember them? One is to get paid, because sometimes domestic companies don't always pay. Foreigners do pay, in most cases, more often. There's a belief that they'll pay. Number 2, they're having symbolic capital. What do we mean by that? If I'm an approved supplier for Apple, guess what I can do? I can go and get more customers. I can get more foreign customers because now I'm associated with Apple. Yes. All right. Number 3, I can learn. I can learn from the foreign company even though I'm not making money. And then with that learning, I can then create products and then sell domestically without telling the foreign company. And finally, which is the diamond in the rough that we talk about, is a supplier that wants to go international. Remember the example of BYD? They did it with Motorola. They came of age. They had their ISO 9000 in place. And guess what? The rest is history. Warren Buffett ended up putting $60 million into BYD back in 2007, 2008. And now they're one of the largest car manufacturers in China. So they come from a small battery manufacturer and now a large car manufacturer. So that's the 4th type of supplier, the supplier that wants to go international. Now let's have a look at these pressures. What did we cite? How many times did we cite these pressures by the international multinational? Number 1, margin pressure. Yes, cost down 5% every 3 months. Number 2, formal contract stipulations, quality, delivery, investment. And this is even before production starts. Apple does this. A lot of multinationals do this. You want a contract with me, then you invest first. Apple does that. Okay, you want a contract with me, then here is our boilerplate contractual stipulation. We will not tailor the contract for you. You need to follow the checklist of our contract. It's boilerplate. And that puts pressure on suppliers to amend their approach to fit in with the international company. Number 3, formal monitoring and training. This is where the international company will give monitoring and training to the supplier, depending on how sophisticated or how complex the component is that is going into the international company's product. Okay, if it's very sophisticated, what you'll find, especially in the smartphone industry, that the HTCs, the Apples, they will work with the suppliers that have sophisticated components. They will work with them much earlier in the product development process, right at the beginning. Remember, it takes about 6 or 7 months to develop a new smartphone from scratch, from zero. Okay, and it used to take 2 years, several years ago, but now they've squeezed that product development life cycle. They will work with the sophisticated suppliers first and the generic suppliers later on in that product development life cycle. Okay, so formal monitoring and training is going to be more intensive depending on whether the supplier is offering a sophisticated product versus a generic product. Let's have a look at relationship and warranty risk. This is very important. And we had cited over 10 times, relationship risk is when you're working with a big international multinational, what you'll find is they tend to have more power, so then that's power for them to move and leave you as a supplier and actually go to another supplier. Suppliers see that. They see that, oh, how long will I have this customer? I'm really worried that if I reveal anything to this multinational, if I reveal that I'm outsourcing, that multinational is going to ditch me and go to another supplier. This is what they're thinking, okay? So you need to cut that short and actually say, look, it's all right if you're outsourcing. Do tell me, I just want to know so I can get the auditor to go to the outsource factory that you're outsourcing to, okay? So cut it off at the beginning, these concerns that suppliers might have. That's a relationship risk. Then there's a warranty risk. And that very telling with one example, one supplier I spoke with, they made the PCB board that goes, and the printed circuit that goes at the back of the speedometer in the Toyota Prius car. They had a product recall and Toyota fined them over $250,000 for this 8 yuan, it's a $1 product in the back of the dashboard. And the supplier couldn't understand such a small part and such a large fine. And the suppliers don't necessarily have this third-party indemnity insurance mentality. Okay, even when we actually mentioned to a supplier, why don't you get insurance for these eventualities, for this risk? And they said, oh, that's a good idea. They don't seem, they're still learning about how they can insure against this risk. So you as a foreigner, you can teach your supplier you're working with to have proper insurance to cover them for certain risks that they may think that are relevant when working with you. Keep that in mind. Number 5 is tax management. Okay, that was a concern when working with international customers, because suddenly things are more formal and suddenly the supplier may have to file a tax return. When they're actually supplying local domestic companies, sometimes things are done by cash. The cash economy is very big in China, so there's less transparent income that the supplier is realizing when they're dealing with domestic companies. When they're dealing with international customers, their income is much more transparent, and that's a problem. And so you need to cut that off and try to explain to the supplier how important that is, because what they might try and do on a customs declaration is actually write down that your product that you're trying to export out of China is only $2 per unit when it really should be $10 a unit, because the supplier wants to report less income, you see. But at the other end, you get into trouble because at the customs in your country holds you up and they say, what's this, $2 a unit? I don't believe that. That's a false misrepresentation of the product you're importing. And so suppliers have this tax management mentality to minimize their income so they don't pay tax. But you've got to explain to them that it's important that they realize all that income or represent it perfectly in the customs declaration, because that will hold you up at the other end. Okay, export costs is another big thing that's a concern of suppliers, especially in the toy industry. I spoke to a toy manufacturer in Jiangsu province, which is just south of Shanghai. Remember, you've got Zhejiang province, very big on electrical, just north of Shanghai. You've got Shanghai, and then you've got Jiangsu province just south. Okay, so electrical, you've got Shanghai, and then you've got toys. Of course, there's other industries in Jiangsu province, but toy manufacturing is very big. And they told me that when we sell internationally, over 1/3 of the final price is actually in the shipping costs. That's a huge amount for such a small cost toy. And so when they sell domestically, they can sell at a price to their distributors for even 1/3 less than what they sell the overseas company and still make money. So there's a lot of margin to be gained by avoiding exporting in the toy industry, and they want to sell locally instead because of these export costs. So keep in mind these issues. You as a buyer, when you're working with a supplier, think back, check back on all of these. Is your supplier that you're about to work with, do they have concerns of any one of these? And there are 11 concerns here. Okay, is there any one of these concerns here? You might be able to head that off and bring that into the discussion, especially at the negotiation stage. If you don't bring it in then, and it is a concern, then it may affect the supplier's performance later on. They may try to cut corners without telling you. They may miss a delivery for a concern that they have. They may misrepresent the customs declaration because of a concern. You see, these concerns are very important of the supplier, but they affect you if you don't take these concerns on board and factor it into negotiations and then bring that into the contract so you both have the same expectation about what is going to be delivered. Okay, so let's go to the next stage. So here is a very important framework that actually summarizes what we talked about. You have the foreign entrants, you have the foreign customers, and they're putting pressure on the supplier in terms of training costs, product development market pressure, margins, monitoring, and contracts. How do you respond if you're a supplier? Well, without telling the buyer, you might copy. Like the example in the previous session, the QQ car, they copied the axle. They went to the supplier of the GM Chevrolet, and they said, oh, you're making the GM Spark. and you're making the axle, you're doing 100,000 run for GM. How about you do 120,000 and you pay me marginal, I'll pay you marginal cost for the 20,000 extra. We take that 20,000 extra back to our factory and put it on our car. And that happens all the time. If the pressure is so great that there's no other way to actually get cheaper parts and cheaper materials. So look out for that. If the pressure's on the supplier, then there's the incentive there to do this, okay? Next, outsource cheaper materials. That's happened in milk, that happened in toys. You need to be totally aware of that, and that can cause a crisis of confidence if it becomes associated with your product. Even more important, you really need to pay very sensitive attention to the outsourcing of cheaper materials. How does that affect the final product of your product? All right, how does that affect the final design, the final look, the final feel of your product? Okay. Next is cheaper labour. That can affect your reputation too. And increasingly, you've got bodies around the world putting pressure on international buyers in terms of making sure that their supply chain is cheap labour free. That is, labour is paid more than the minimum wage in every province. Now we do know, I've been in the factories in China where I found they actually are under the radar. They are working under the radar. They are paying below minimum wage. How can they do that? Number one, they are small. Okay, they're small enough, 150 employees or less. Number two, they get subsidies from the government, okay? And number three, they're employing more locals in a province. And so the government is happy to turn the other cheek, okay, and not look at this factory because that factory is employing locals. And so that's how they do it. And that continues in China to this day, okay? So keep that in mind. Factories will do that. You need to be extra vigilant. You need to have the corporate social responsibility audit done if that's very important to your reputation risk internationally. Okay, and then we move to process improvement. This is the big kahuna. This is the big thing that you want suppliers to focus on. And it's sometimes, often, the last thing the suppliers will focus on when they're under there's so much pressure. But you can help them. Coles Myer, operating out of China, got 30 suppliers operating out of Shanghai. They're managing, they're setting up a ERP system that links the suppliers with the sourcing office in Shanghai because they want to reduce their design time, the start of new women's clothes and baby clothes designs from 80 days down to 40 days. And they know that will not happen if they just get on the phone to the supplier and say, we want that done half the time compared to last year. Just do it quick or we're going to kick you off our approved supply list. That does not work in China. What does work is, how can we help you do this faster? And find a way, use technology or have people on the ground come and do training at the supplier. You need to help the supplier develop the capability to change. Often they don't have the capability to change. They want to change, but they don't know how to. And you as a buyer can have that secret sauce to help the suppliers to make the change that can benefit both the supplier and yourself. So let's have a look. Process improvement. Notice that this is the big framework. This is what you need to be focusing on. This is great to take into negotiations, to tick off, to find out where is the supplier under pressure. You have the list of 11 items that we found from the interviews. Which of those 11 items are relevant to the suppliers you're trying to source from? Which of those 11 items are likely to be pressures in your supply chain? And then respond and protect accordingly. That's the big takeaway you want to take with this framework. So thank you for this session, and we'll see you in the next session.